Physiological basis of purposive behavior of animals and humans. Let's wait for the students who are late for the lecture. One of the sections of today's lecture will be IQ, intelligence quotient. Let's try to evaluate your intelligence. You have to answer the question and write in the chat. I will look and note in the electronic journal who is present at the lecture. If there is no answer, then I will post absence. Write the answer in the general chat of the BBB. Let's wait for the students who are late for the lecture. One of the sections of today's lecture will be IQ, intelligence quotient. Let's try to evaluate your intelligence. The solution. Here is the logic that had to be found to solve this puzzle. The first equation gives 5 plus 5 equals 11. It is obtained by adding 1 or 10. The second equation follows this same approach, 6 plus 6 equals 14, or 6 plus 6 equals 12 plus 2. Then we just need to take this logic to the last equation such that. Thus, in the last equation, we need add the answer with 5. We obtain then 9 plus 9 equals 18 plus 5 equals 23. Physiological basis of purposive behavior of animals and humans. Handbook of Psychophysiology, Cambridge Handbooks in Psychology. 4th edition. Psychology and Psychophysiology. Psychology. Psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior in humans and non-humans. Psi, the first letter of the Greek word psyche from which the term psychology is derived, is commonly associated with the science. Psychology includes the study of conscious and unconscious phenomena, including feelings and thoughts. It is an academic discipline of immense scope, crossing the boundaries between the natural and social sciences. Psychologists seek an understanding of the emergent properties of brains, linking the discipline to neuroscience. As social scientists, psychologists aim to understand the behavior of individuals and groups. Emergence occurs when an entity is observed to have properties its parts do not have on their own, properties or behaviors that emerge only when the parts interact in a wider whole. Emergence plays a central role in theories of integrative levels and of complex systems. For instance, the phenomenon of behavior as studied in physiology is an emergent property of synaptology. A professional practitioner or researcher involved in the discipline is called a psychologist. Some psychologists can also be classified as 1. Behavioral or 2. Cognitive scientists. Some psychologists attempt to understand the role of mental functions in individual and social behavior. Others explore the physiological and neurobiological processes that underlie cognitive functions and behaviors. Psychophysiology. Psychophysiology is the branch of psychology that is concerned with the physiological basis of psychological processes. While psychophysiology was a general broad field of research in the 1960s and 1970s, it has now become quite specialized, based on methods, topic of studies and scientific traditions. Methods vary as combinations of, such as EEG, neuroimaging, MRI, PET, and electrophysiological methods neurochemistry. Topics have branched into subspecializations such as social, sport, cognitive, cardiovascular, clinical and other branches of psychophysiology. Neuroimaging. Parasagittal MRI of the head in a patient with benign familial macrocephaly. Purpose indirectly, directly, image structure, function/pharmacology of the nervous system. Neuroimaging. Sagittal MRI slice at the midline. Neuroimaging. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and arterial spin labeling, ASL, relies on the paramagnetic properties of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin to see images of changing blood flow in the brain associated with neural activity. This allows images to be generated that reflect which brain structures are activated, and how, during the performance of different tasks or at resting state. According to the oxygenation hypothesis, changes in oxygen usage in regional cerebral blood flow during cognitive or behavioral activity can be associated with the regional neurons as being directly related to the cognitive or behavioral tasks being attended. Some people have difficulty distinguishing a psychophysiologist from a physiological psychologist, two very different perspectives. Psychologists are interested in why we may fear spiders, and physiologists may be interested in the input/output system of the amygdala. A psychophysiologist will attempt to link the two. Psychophysiologists generally study the psychological/physiological link in intact human subjects. While early psychophysiologists almost always examined the impact of psychological states on physiological system responses, since the 1970s, psychophysiologists also frequently study the impact of physiological states and systems on psychological states and processes. It is this perspective of studying the interface of mind and body that makes psychophysiologists most distinct. Physiological psychology is a subdivision of behavioral neuroscience, biological psychology, that studies the neural mechanisms of perception and behavior through direct manipulation of the brains of non-human animal subjects in controlled experiments. This field of psychology takes an empirical and practical approach when studying the brain and human behavior. Most scientists in this field believe that the mind is a phenomenon that stems from the nervous system. By studying and gaining knowledge about the mechanisms of the nervous system, physiological psychologists can uncover many truths about human behavior. Unlike other subdivisions within biological psychology, the main focus of psychological research is the development of theories that describe brain-behavior relationships. Physiological psychology studies many topics relating to the body's response to a behavior or activity in an organism. It concerns the brain cells, structures, components, and chemical interactions that are involved in order to produce actions. Psychologists in this field usually focus their attention to topics such as sleep, emotion, ingestion, senses, reproductive behavior, learning/memory, communication, psychopharmacology, and neurological disorders. The basis for these studies all surround themselves around the notion of how the nervous system intertwines with other systems in the body to create a specific behavior. 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 Behavior, American English, or behavior, British English, is the range of actions and mannerisms made by individuals, organisms, systems, or artificial entities in some environment. These systems can include other systems or organisms as well as the inanimate physical environment. It is the computed response of the system or organism to various stimuli or inputs, whether internal or external, conscious or subconscious, overt or covert, and voluntary or involuntary. Taking a behavior informatics perspective, a behavior consists of actor, operation, interactions, and their properties. This can be represented as a behavior vector. Behaviorism is a systematic approach to understanding the behavior of humans and other animals. It assumes that behavior is either a reflex evoked by the pairing of certain antecedent stimuli in the environment, or a consequence of that individual's history, including especially reinforcement and punishment contingencies, together with the individual's current motivational state and controlling stimuli. Although behaviorists generally accept the important role of heredity in determining behavior, they focus primarily on environmental events. Behaviorism emerged in the early 1900s as a reaction to depth psychology and other traditional forms of psychology, which often had difficulty making predictions that could be tested experimentally, but derived from earlier research in the late 19th century, such as when Edward Thorndike pioneered the law of effect, a procedure that involved the use of consequences to strengthen or weaken behavior. With a 1924 publication, John Watson devised methodological behaviorism, which rejected introspective methods and sought to understand behavior by only measuring observable behaviors and events. Physiology of higher nervous activity, HNA. Physiology of higher nervous activity, HNA, is a section of physiology distinguished in the post-Soviet space that studies the functions of the higher department of the central nervous system, the cerebral cortex, through which the most complex relationships of a highly developed organism with the external environment are provided. Engaged in the study of the nervous mechanisms of behavior and mental activity. The foundations of science are laid in the works of I.M. Sechenov and I.P. Pavlov, who revealed the content and properties of the physiological mechanisms of the mental activity of the brain. The physiology of HNA is a science of the neurophysiological mechanisms of the psyche and behavior, based on the principle of reflex reflection of the external world, is based on experimental research methods. Reflex. There are many definitions of reflex in biology. We fully agree with the following definitions. Reflex is a stereotypical, standard, identical for the same conditions, reaction of a living organism to any effect, stimulus, taking place with the participation of receptors and under the control of the nervous system. 5 stages in the development of the reflex theory. 17th century. René Descartes. 18th century. Yuri, George, Prokoska. 19th century. Ivan Sechenov. 20th century, beginning. Ivan Pavlov. 20th century, mid. Petr Nokin. 17th century. René Descartes. Mechanical concept of reflex. The concept of reflex arose in the teachings of René Descartes. Reflex, the movement of animal spirits from the brain to the muscles by the type of reflection of a light beam. External objects act on the peripheral endings of the nerve threads located inside the neural tubes, which, when stretched, open the valves of the openings leading from the brain to the nerves. Through the channels of these nerves, animal spirits move to the corresponding muscles, which as a result swell, and thus movement occurs. 18th century. Yuri Prokoska. The biological concept of the reflex. Yuri Prokoska supplements Descartes' concept with the concept of the biological purpose of the reflex structure. Introduced the term reflex, 1800, and formulated the provision on the SR connection. The response reflex reaction always manifests itself in sizes corresponding to the strength of the applied stimulus. 19th century. Ivan Sechenov. Psychophysiological concept of Sechenov's reflex. A reflex is a universal and peculiar form of interaction between an organism and its environment, based on evolutionary biology. There are 2 types of reflexes. Permanent, congenital, carried out by the lower parts of the nervous system. The reflexes of the brain are changeable, acquired in individual life. It is both a physiological and a mental phenomenon. 20th century, beginning. Ivan Pavlov. The concept of a conditioned reflex. Pavlov. The scientific concept of the conditioned reflex. A reflex is a stereotyped reaction of a living organism to a stimulus, which takes place with the participation of the nervous system. There are, unconditioned, carried out by congenital, hereditarily fixed nerve pathways, conditional, carried out through neural connections that are formed in the process of individual life of a person or animal. 20th century, middle. Peter Anokin. Anokin considered behavior as a systemic process. According to Anokin, the organization of behavior is based on functional systems. Who developed the scientific concept of the conditioned reflex? Anokin. Descartes. Pavlov. Prokoska. Sechenov. Who developed the scientific concept of the conditioned reflex? Who developed the scientific concept of the conditioned reflex? Of course.
Ivan Petrovich Pavlov.
The simplest reflex is initiated by a stimulus, which activates an afferent nerve. The signal is then passed to a efferent response neuron, which generates a response. The morphological basis of the reflex is the reflex arc. Reflex arc, nervous arc, the nerve path traversed by nerve impulses during the implementation of the reflex. Who introduced the concept of reflex arc into physiology? Marshall Hall, 1790 to 1857, was an English physician, physiologist, and early neurologist. His name is attached to the theory of reflex arc mediated by the spinal cord, to a method of resuscitation of drowned people, and to the elucidation of function of capillary vessels. His most important work in physiology was concerned with the theory of reflex action, embodied in a paper on the reflex function of the medulla oblongata and the medulla spinalis, 1833, which was supplemented in 1837 by another on the true spinal marrow, and the excitomotor system of nerves. In this theory, he stated that the spinal cord is comprised by a chain of units that functions as an independent reflex arcs, and their activity integrates sensory and motor nerves at the segment of the spinal cord from which these nerves originate. He proposed in addition that those arcs are interconnected and interacting in the production of coordinated movement. Sensory system vs. reflex arc. How is the sensory system different from the reflex arc? Can the sensory system be part of the reflex arc, or can the reflex arc be part of the sensory system? The reflex arc has afferent, sensory, and efferent, motor, parts. The sensory system does not have an efferent, motor, part, and the structures of the sensory system can be the afferent, sensory, part of the reflex arc. The sensory system does not have an efferent, motor, part, and the structures of the sensory system can be the afferent, sensory, part of the reflex arc. The pathway taken by the nerve impulse to accomplish a reflex action is called the reflex arc. A reflex arc is a neural pathway that controls a reflex. In vertebrates, most sensory neurons do not pass directly into the brain, but synapse in the spinal cord. This allows for faster reflex actions to occur by activating spinal motor neurons without the delay of routing signals through the brain. The brain will receive the input while the reflex is being carried out, and the analysis of the signal takes place after the reflex action. There are two types: autonomic reflex arc, affecting inner organs, and somatic reflex arc, affecting muscles. Autonomic reflexes sometimes involve the spinal cord, and some somatic reflexes are mediated more by the brain than the spinal cord. There are two types: autonomic reflex arc, affecting inner organs, and somatic reflex arc, affecting muscles. Autonomic reflexes sometimes involve the spinal cord, and some somatic reflexes are mediated more by the brain than the spinal cord. During a somatic reflex, nerve signals travel along the following pathway. Somatic receptors in the skin, muscles, and tendons. Afferent nerve fibers carry signals from the somatic receptors to the posterior horn of the spinal cord or to the brain stem. An integrating center, the point at which the neurons that compose the gray matter of the spinal cord or brain stem synapse. Efferent nerve fibers carry motor nerve signals from the anterior horn to the muscles. Effector muscle innervated by the efferent nerve fiber carries out the response. A reflex arc, then, is the pathway followed by nerves which, a. carry sensory information from the receptor to the spinal cord, and then, b. carry the response generated by the spinal cord to effector organs during a reflex action. A sensory system is the path followed by the nerves that, a. transmit sensory information from the receptor to the cerebral cortex to analyze the sensory information. What's right? A. The reflex arc may be part of the sensory system. B. Part of the sensory system may be a reflex arc. C. Part of the sensory system may be part of the reflex arc. Startle reflex. Let's repeat again. Reflexes are found with varying levels of complexity in organisms with a nervous system. A reflex occurs via neural pathways in the nervous system called reflex arcs. A stimulus initiates a neural signal, which is carried to a synapse. The signal is then transferred across the synapse to a motor neuron, which evokes a target response. These neural signals do not always travel to the brain, so many reflexes are an automatic response to a stimulus that does not receive or need conscious thought. Many reflexes are fine-tuned to increase organism survival and self-defense. This is observed in reflexes such as the startle reflex, which provides an automatic response to an unexpected stimulus, and the feline righting reflex, which reorients a cat's body when falling to ensure safe landing. The simplest type of reflex, a short latency reflex, has a single synapse, or junction, in the signaling pathway. Long latency reflexes produce nerve signals that are transduced across multiple synapses before generating the reflex response. Tactile, acoustic, and vestibular systems sum to elicit the startle reflex. Reflex modulation. Some might imagine that reflexes are immutable. In reality, however, most reflexes are flexible and can be substantially modified to match the requirements of the behavior in both vertebrates and invertebrates. A good example of reflex modulation is the stretch reflex. When a muscle is stretched at rest, the stretch reflex leads to contraction of the muscle, thereby opposing stretch resistance reflex. This helps to stabilize posture. During voluntary movements, however, the intensity, gain, of the reflex is reduced or its sign is even reversed. This prevents resistance reflexes from impeding movements. Figure. An example of reflex reversal is depicted. Activating the same spinal reflex pathway can cause limb flexion while standing, and extension while walking. The myotatic or muscle stretch reflexes, sometimes known as deep tendon reflexes, provide information on the integrity of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. This information can be detected using electromyography, EMG. Generally, decreased reflexes indicate a peripheral problem, and lively or exaggerated reflex is a central one. A stretch reflex is the contraction of a muscle in response to its lengthwise stretch. Biceps reflex, C5, C6. Brachioradialis reflex, C5, C6, C7. Extensor digitorum reflex, C6, C7. Triceps reflex, C6, C7, C8. Patellar reflex or knee jerk reflex, L2, L3, L4. Ankle jerk reflex, Achilles reflex, S1, S2. While the reflexes above are stimulated mechanically, the term H reflex refers to the analogous reflex stimulated electrically, and tonic vibration reflex for those stimulated to vibration. Types of human reflexes. Tendon reflex. A tendon reflex is the contraction of a muscle in response to striking its tendon. The Golgi tendon reflex is the inverse of a stretch reflex. Patellar reflex. The patellar reflex, also called the knee reflex or knee jerk, is a stretch reflex which tests the L2, L3, and L4 segments of the spinal cord. Many animals, most significantly humans, have been seen to have the patellar reflex, including dogs, cats, horses, and other mammalian species. History. Wilhelm Heinrich Erb and Carl Friedrich Westphal simultaneously reported the patellar tendon or knee reflex in 1875. The term knee jerk was recorded by Sir Michael Foster in his textbook of physiology in 1877. Striking the tendon below the patella gives rise to a sudden extension of the leg, known as the knee jerk. Patellar reflex. Mechanism. Representation of the patellar reflex pathway. Striking of the patellar tendon with a reflex hammer just below the patella stretches the muscle spindle in the quadriceps muscle. This produces a signal which travels back to the spinal cord and synapses, without interneurons, at the level of L3 or L4 in the spinal cord, completely independent of higher centers. From there, an alpha motor neuron conducts an efferent impulse back to the quadriceps femoris muscle, triggering contraction. This contraction, coordinated with the relaxation of the antagonistic flexor hamstring muscle, causes the leg to kick. There is a latency of around 18 milliseconds between stretch of the patellar tendon and the beginning of contraction of the quadriceps femoris muscle. This is a reflex of proprioception which helps maintain posture and balance, allowing to keep one's balance with little effort or conscious thought. The patellar reflex is a clinical and classic example of the monosynaptic reflex arc. There is no interneuron in the pathway leading to contraction of the quadriceps muscle. Instead, the sensory neuron synapses directly on a motor neuron in the spinal cord. However, there is an inhibitory interneuron used to relax the antagonistic hamstring muscle, reciprocal innervation. This test of a basic automatic reflex may be influenced by the patient consciously inhibiting or exaggerating the response. The doctor may use the Jędrowski maneuver in order to ensure a more valid reflex test. Mechanism. Representation of the patellar reflex pathway. Striking of the patellar tendon with a reflex hammer just below the patella stretches the muscle spindle in the quadriceps muscle. This produces a signal which travels back to the spinal cord and synapses, without interneurons, at the level of L3 or L4 in the spinal cord, completely independent of higher centers. From there, an alpha motor neuron conducts an efferent impulse back to the quadriceps femoris muscle, triggering contraction. This contraction, coordinated with the relaxation of the antagonistic flexor hamstring muscle, causes the leg to kick. There is a latency of around 18 milliseconds between stretch of the patellar tendon and the beginning of contraction of the quadriceps femoris muscle. This is a reflex of proprioception which helps maintain posture and balance, allowing to keep one's balance with little effort or conscious thought. The patellar reflex is a clinical and classic example of the monosynaptic reflex arc. There is no interneuron in the pathway leading to contraction of the quadriceps muscle. Instead, the sensory neuron synapses directly on a motor neuron in the spinal cord. However, there is an inhibitory interneuron used to relax the antagonistic hamstring muscle, reciprocal innervation. This test of a basic automatic reflex may be influenced by the patient consciously inhibiting or exaggerating the response. The doctor may use the Jędrowski maneuver in order to ensure a more valid reflex test. Jędrowski maneuver. The Jędrowski maneuver is a medical maneuver wherein the patient clenches the teeth, flexes both sets of fingers into a hook-like form, and interlocks those sets of fingers together. The tendon below the patient's knee is then hit with a reflex hammer to elicit the patellar reflex. The elicited response is compared with the reflex result of the same action when the maneuver is not in use. Often a larger reflex response will be observed when the patient is occupied with the maneuver. A weak or apparently missing reflex could be triggered by afferent activity resulting from such muscle tension. This is the true explanation for the maneuver, not a diversion of the patient's attention, a misconception that can be heard even today. This effect was first observed in the late 19th century by Hungarian physician Ernő Jendrosik, after whom it was named. This maneuver is particularly useful in that even if the patient is aware of the maneuver's purpose, it still functions properly. Grading. In medicine, reflexes are often used to assess the health of the nervous system. Doctors will typically grade the activity of a reflex on a scale from 0 to 4. While 2+ is considered normal, some healthy individuals are hyporeflexive and register all reflexes at 1+, while others are hyperreflexive and register all reflexes at 3+. Reflexes involving cranial nerves. Pupillary light reflex. Sensory. Second pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Third pair of cranial nerves. Accommodation reflex. Sensory. Second pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Third pair of cranial nerves. Jaw jerk reflex. Sensory. Fifth pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Fifth pair of cranial nerves. Corneal reflex, also known as the blink reflex. Sensory. Fifth pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Seventh pair of cranial nerves. Glabellar reflex. Sensory. Fifth pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Seventh pair of cranial nerves. Vestibulo-ocular reflex. Sensory. Eighth pair of cranial nerves. Motor. Third, fourth, sixth plus. Pairs of cranial nerves. Gag reflex. Sensory. Ninth pair of cranial nerves. Motor. 10th pair of cranial nerves. Physiology of higher nervous activity is scientific trend of Russian physiological school and study of purposive behavior of animals and humans. One of mechanisms of adaptation of animals and humans to the variable environment is nervous activity based on reflex mechanisms. In the process of the evolution, genetically reinforced responses, unconditioned reflexes, have been established that integrate and coordinate functions of different organs and provide adaptation of an organism. In individual life, humans and higher animals develop qualitatively new reflex responses that were termed conditioned reflexes by Ivan Pavlov and were regarded by him as the most perfect form of adaptation. The main dynamically alternating processes in the CNS are excitation and inhibition. Their interrelations, force, and localization determine controlling functions of the cortex. According to I. Pavlov, a functional unit of the higher nervous activity is a conditioned reflex. The higher nervous activity is a complex of conditioned and unconditioned reflexes and of higher mental functions that provides reasonable behavior under variable natural and social conditions. First suggestions about the reflex nature of the activity of higher divisions of the brain were belonged to Ivan Sechenov, and later on this reflex principle was extended to the mental activity of humans. Sechenov's ideas were experimentally confirmed by Ivan Pavlov, who developed a method of objective evaluation of functions of the higher divisions of the brain, a method of conditioned reflexes. Why did Pavlov win the Nobel Prize? For achievements in the study of digestion. For achievements in the study of conditioned reflexes. For the creation of a new science, higher nervous activity. Why did Pavlov win the Nobel Prize? The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine 1904 was awarded to Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, in recognition of his work on the physiology of digestion, through which knowledge on vital aspects of the subject has been transformed and enlarged. Conditioned and unconditioned reflexes. Classification of conditioned reflexes. Rules of formation of conditioned reflexes. Ivan Pavlov showed that all reflexes could be classified into two groups, unconditioned and conditioned. Comparative characteristics of unconditioned and conditioned reflexes are given in table. Comparative characteristics of unconditioned and conditioned reflexes. 1. Unconditioned reflexes. Inborn, inherited responses, the majority of which start functioning immediately after birth. Conditioned reflexes. Acquired throughout life of an individual. 2. Unconditioned reflexes. Species reflexes, inherent to all representatives of the species. Conditioned reflexes. Individual reflexes. 3. Unconditioned reflexes. Permanent reflexes that persist throughout life. Conditioned reflexes. Impermanent reflexes, may appear and disappear. 4. Unconditioned reflexes. Realized on the lower levels of CNS, subcortical nuclei, brainstem, spinal cord. Conditioned reflexes are primarily functions of the cerebral cortex. 5. Unconditioned reflexes occur in response to certain adequate stimuli acting on certain receptive fields. Conditioned reflexes occur in response to any stimuli acting on different receptive fields. Unconditioned reflexes may be simple and complex. Complex inborn unconditioned reflexes are called instincts. The characteristic feature of instincts is that they present a chain of reactions following each other in a strictly defined order. A conditioned reflex is a complex multi-component reaction established on the basis of an unconditioned reflex using a preceding neutral stimulus. It has a signaling character and prepares an organism for the forthcoming unconditioned stimulus. An example is redistribution of blood in the body, enhancement of breathing and circulation in a pre-start period, in running competitions, so that an individual gets prepared for a muscle effort before it begins. Rules of formation of conditioned reflexes. 1. Use of 2 stimuli, one of which is unconditioned, food, painful stimulus etc., that causes an unconditioned response, and the other is conditioned, or signaling stimulus, light, sound, sight of food etc., that signals about a forthcoming unconditioned stimulus. 2. Multiple repetition of combinations of conditioned and unconditioned stimuli, although sometimes only one combination may be enough. 3. A conditioned stimulus should precede an unconditioned one. 4. A conditioned stimulus may be any external or internal stimulus that is neutral as far as possible, causes no defense response, is not excessively strong but catching attention. 5. An unconditioned stimulus should be strong enough to form a temporary connection in the brain. 6. An unconditioned stimulus should produce a stronger excitation than a conditioned stimulus. 7. Any extra stimuli should be excluded to prevent external inhibition of a conditioned reflex. 8. An animal in which a conditioned reflex is being established should be healthy. 9. To establish a conditioned reflex, an animal should be motivated. For example, a salivary reflex can be established only in a hungry animal because in a fed-up animal this reflex will not be established. What's right? A. An unconditioned stimulus should produce a stronger excitation than a conditioned stimulus. B. A conditioned stimulus should produce a stronger excitation than an unconditioned stimulus. A. An unconditioned stimulus should produce a stronger excitation than a conditioned stimulus. It's right. Classification of conditioned reflexes. Conditioned reflexes are more easily established to stimuli to which an animal is ecologically adapted. In this context, conditioned reflexes are classified into natural and artificial. Natural conditioned reflexes are established to signals inherent to the stimulus that in natural conditions induces an unconditioned reflex, for example, sight of food, its smell, etc. All the rest conditioned reflexes are artificial, that is, they are established to factors not associated with an unconditioned stimulus, for example, a salivary reflex to a sound. Higher order conditioned reflexes, second, third, and higher orders. A stable conditioned food reflex established, for example, to light, is a first-order conditioned reflex. It may be used as the basis for a second-order conditioned reflex, for which a new preceding signal, for example, a sound, is introduced, reinforced by the first-order conditioned stimulus, in our example by light. After several combinations of sound and light, the sound stimulus also starts to induce salivation. Thus, a new and a more complex mediated temporary connection is formed. It should be emphasized that reinforcement of the second-order conditioned reflex is a conditioned stimulus of the first-order reflex, light, but not an unconditioned stimulus, food, because reinforcement of both light and sound with food leads to establishment of two separate first-order conditioned reflexes. A sufficiently stable second-order conditioned reflex may be used to establish a third-order conditioned reflex. For this, a new stimulus is introduced, for example, touching the skin. Here, a touch is reinforced only by the second-order stimulus, sound, which stimulates the visual center, which in turn stimulates the feeding center. Thus, a still more complex temporary connection is formed. Reflexes of higher orders, fourth, fifth, and sixth, can be established only in primates and humans. Systemic character of brain activity. Concept of dynamic stereotype. In certain situations, separate conditioned reflexes may combine into complexes. If several conditioned reflexes are performed in a strictly defined sequence, and this sequence repeats many times at regular intervals, in the brain an integral system will finally establish consisting of the specific sequence of reflex responses, that is, previously separate reflexes arrange into a single complex. Neurons of the brain, despite their high functional mobility, can, nevertheless, strongly retain the sequence of responses to repeated conditioned stimulations. This is the basis of a dynamic stereotype, which actually is a stable and fixed system of responses to different conditioned signals following one another in a strictly defined sequence at definite intervals. Afterwards, application of only the first stimulus elicits the whole chain of responses. A dynamic stereotype is a characteristic feature of human mental activity. Many of our skills, example ability to write, play musical instruments, dance, and etc., are actually chains of automatic motor actions. Throughout life, more complex behavioral stereotypes are established: behavioral patterns after wake up or before going to bed, working skills, resting and eating habits. Dynamic stereotypes are responsible for relatively stable patterns of social behavior, for relationships among people, for evaluation of current events and for responses to them. These stereotypes are extremely significant in life, since they permit an individual to perform many activities with the minimal tension of the nervous system. Biological sense of dynamic stereotypes is that they rid the cortical centers of the necessity to solve routine problems each time de novo and permit them to focus on more complex tasks requiring creative thinking. Conducting experiments. The development of the conditioned reflex was carried out as follows. The experimental animal was installed in the machine. A. During the giving of food, one could observe how saliva was secreted from the fistula. This is a manifestation of the unconditioned food reflex. Then, 30 seconds before feeding, a light bulb was lit in front of the dog. B. At first, turning on the light did not lead to the release of saliva, because the light bulb is an indifferent stimulus in relation to the digestive function. However, the animal triggered an inborn orienting reflex, which manifested itself in the dog's reaction to the stimulus. C. After multiple repetitions of lighting the bulb before feeding, the light turned into a signal indicating that food would appear after it. D. This led to the release of digestive juice even before receiving food. The light turned into a conditioned stimulus. In addition to light, others were used as conditioned stimuli: the sound of a trumpet, the scratching of an animal. These irritants from indifferent became conditional. It can be seen from the description of the experiments that conditioned reflexes are formed on the basis of unconditioned ones. The release of digestive juices in response to food acts as an unconditioned reflex, therefore, food is an unconditioned stimulus. Light in the initial experiments is an indifferent stimulus, but its repetition on the eve of giving food turns it into a conditioned one. Conducting experiments. The development of the conditioned reflex was carried out as follows. The experimental animal was installed in the machine. A. During the giving of food, one could observe how saliva was secreted from the fistula. This is a manifestation of the unconditioned food reflex. Then, 30 seconds before feeding, a light bulb was lit in front of the dog. B. At first, turning on the light did not lead to the release of saliva, because the light bulb is an indifferent stimulus in relation to the digestive function. However, the animal triggered an inborn orienting reflex, which manifested itself in the dog's reaction to the stimulus. C. After multiple repetitions of lighting the bulb before feeding, the light turned into a signal indicating that food would appear after it. D. This led to the release of digestive juice even before receiving food. The light turned into a conditioned stimulus. In addition to light, others were used as conditioned stimuli: the sound of a trumpet, the scratching of an animal. These irritants from indifferent became conditional. It can be seen from the description of the experiments that conditioned reflexes are formed on the basis of unconditioned ones. The release of digestive juices in response to food acts as an unconditioned reflex, therefore, food is an unconditioned stimulus. Light in the initial experiments is an indifferent stimulus, but its repetition on the eve of giving food turns it into a conditioned one. Theory of formation of temporary connections underlying formation of conditioned reflexes. A physiological basis for conditioned reflexes is establishment of temporary functional connections at the higher levels of the nervous system. A temporary connection is a complex of neurophysiological, biochemical, and ultrastructural changes in the brain induced by a combined action of conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. Ivan Pavlov suggested that in the process of establishment of a conditioned reflex, temporary neural connections are formed between two groups of cortical cells, cortical representatives of conditioned and of unconditioned reflexes. Excitation spreads from the center of a conditioned reflex to the center of an unconditioned reflex neuron by neuron. So, the first way of establishment of temporary connections between centers of conditioned and unconditioned reflexes is realized within the cortex. However, after destruction of the cortical center of the conditioned reflex, the established reflex is preserved. So, it is reasonable to suggest formation of temporary connections between the subcortical center of the conditioned reflex and the cortical center of the unconditioned reflex. When the cortical representation of the unconditioned reflex is destructed, the conditioned reflex nevertheless persists. Thus, a temporary connection is likely to be established between the cortical center of the conditioned reflex and the subcortical center of the unconditioned reflex. Separation of the cortical centers of conditioned and unconditioned reflexes by transection of the cerebral cortex does not prevent establishment of a conditioned reflex. This shows the probability for formation of temporary connections between the cortical center of a conditioned reflex, the subcortical center of an unconditioned reflex, and the cortical center of an unconditioned reflex. There exist different opinions as to the mechanisms of formation of temporary connections. A temporary connection is presumably established on the basis of the principle of dominant. Excitation focus caused by unconditioned stimulus is always stronger than that caused by a conditioned stimulus because unconditioned stimuli are always more biologically significant. Since this excitation focus is dominating, it attracts excitation from the focus of the conditioned stimulation. Once this excitation has made its way through some neuronal pathways, next time it will pass these ways much more readily, a phenomenon of a beaten path, due to summation of excitations, long-term increase in excitation of synapses, increase in the amount of transmitters in synapses, formation of new synapses. All these factors create structural predispositions for facilitation of propagation of the excitation through neuronal networks. Another idea of the mechanism of formation of temporary connections is the theory of convergence. This theory rests on the ability of neurons to receive stimuli of different modalities. According to Anokin, conditioned and unconditioned stimuli cause an extensive activation of cortical neurons through activation of the reticular formation. In result, the ascending signals, from a conditioned and an unconditioned stimuli, overlap, and their excitations meet, or converge, on the same cortical neurons. This convergence of excitations results in establishment and stabilization of temporary connections between cortical representations of conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. Inhibition of conditioned reflexes. Inhibition of conditioned reflexes. First of all, the inhibition of conditioned reflexes is divided into two large groups. A. Internal, conditioned, weaning, occurs when the conditioned reflex is not needed, is not reinforced. And B. External, unconditioned, distraction, the conditioned reflex is inhibited, but now this is due to a strong external stimulus. The light is on, where is my bone?
I turned on the light. Will you have a bone?
Ah! Do you hear this sound? Inhibition of conditioned reflexes. To ensure adaptation and adequate behavior, it is important not only to generate new conditioned reflexes and preserve them for a long time, but also to eliminate reflexes no longer needed by the body. Conditioned reflexes are eliminated by inhibition. Pavlov distinguished the following forms of cortical inhibition: unconditioned, inborn, and conditioned, acquired. Unconditioned inhibition. This kind of inhibition of conditioned reflexes occurs immediately after action of some extra stimulus, that is, it is an inborn, unconditioned type of inhibition. There are two kinds of unconditioned inhibition, external and protective. External inhibition is induced by introduction of a new stimulus, which creates a dominating excitation focus that evokes an orientation. What is it? Reflex. Biological significance of external inhibition is that by inhibiting the current conditioned reflex activity, it permits an organism to switch over to evaluation of significance and probable danger of a new stimulus. Unconditioned inhibition. This kind of inhibition of conditioned reflexes occurs immediately after action of some extra stimulus, that is, it is an inborn, unconditioned type of inhibition. There are two kinds of unconditioned inhibition, external and protective. External inhibition is induced by introduction of a new stimulus, which creates a dominating excitation focus that evokes an orientation. What is it? Reflex. Biological significance of external inhibition is that by inhibiting the current conditioned reflex activity, it permits an organism to switch over to evaluation of significance and probable danger of a new stimulus. A new stimulus, which inhibits existing conditioned reflex, is termed an external inhibitor. Repeated application of this new stimulus causes gradual diminish and finally disappearance of the orientation reflex so that it no longer inhibits conditioned reflexes. Such external inhibiting stimulus is termed an extinguishing inhibitor. If a new stimulus carries some biologically significant information, it inhibits conditioned reflexes every time it acts. Such constant stimulus is termed a constant inhibitor. The biological sense of external inhibition is that it provides conditions for a more important for the moment orientation reflex caused by an emergency stimulus, and permits its fast evaluation. A new stimulus, which inhibits existing conditioned reflex, is termed an external inhibitor. Repeated application of this new stimulus causes gradual diminish and finally disappearance of the orientation reflex so that it no longer inhibits conditioned reflexes. Such external inhibiting stimulus is termed an extinguishing inhibitor. If a new stimulus carries some biologically significant information, it inhibits conditioned reflexes every time it acts. Such constant stimulus is termed a constant inhibitor. The biological sense of external inhibition is that it provides conditions for a more important for the moment orientation reflex caused by an emergency stimulus, and permits its fast evaluation. Protective inhibition. This kind of inborn inhibition differs from external and conditioned inhibitions by the mechanism of initiation and by physiological significance. It is caused by excessive increase in strength or duration of a conditioned stimulus which start to exceed capacities of the cortical cells. This kind of inhibition has a protective significance since it prevents nerve cells from depletion. By mechanism, it is similar to the phenomenon of pessimum described by Wiedenski. Protective inhibition may be caused not only by very strong, but also by weak but persistent and monotonous stimuli. These stimuli permanently acting on the same cortical elements, lead to their depletion, and, consequently, result in protective inhibition. Protective inhibition more easily develops in an individual with a decreased working capacity, for example, after a severe infectious disease, stress, and is more common in elderly people. Conditioned, internal, inhibition. It occurs if a conditioned stimulus stops being reinforced by an unconditioned one. It is called internal inhibition because it is realized in the structural elements of a conditioned reflex. Conditioned inhibition requires some time for formation. This kind of inhibition includes extinctive inhibition, differentiating inhibition, delayed inhibition, and the so-called conditioned inhibitor. Extinctive inhibition. Extinctive inhibition develops when a conditioned stimulus stops being reinforced by an unconditioned one, which results in a gradual disappearance, extinction, of the conditioned response. On the first application of the conditioned stimulus without reinforcement, the conditioned response occurs as usual. Repeated applications of the conditioned stimulus without reinforcement initiate an orientation response which soon extincts, and the conditioned reflex gradually disappears too. Differentiating, discriminative, inhibition. Differentiating, discriminative, inhibition develops in response to stimuli with characteristics similar to those of the conditioned stimulus. This kind of inhibition is based on differentiation, discrimination, between stimuli. It permits to select from similar stimuli only those that are reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus, in other words, stimuli which are more biologically significant for an organism. An example is secretion of saliva in a dog to a metronome sound with frequency of 120 beats/min. The sound with 60 beats/min frequency applied without reinforcement at first also causes salivation, but after some time the dog starts to differentiate between stimuli and does not salivate to 60 beat/min frequency. Differentiating, discriminative, inhibition. Differentiating, discriminative, inhibition develops in response to stimuli with characteristics similar to those of the conditioned stimulus. This kind of inhibition is based on differentiation, discrimination, between stimuli. It permits to select from similar stimuli only those that are reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus, in other words, stimuli which are more biologically significant for an organism. An example is secretion of saliva in a dog to a metronome sound with frequency of 120 beats/min. The sound with 60 beats/min frequency applied without reinforcement at first also causes salivation, but after some time the dog starts to differentiate between stimuli and does not salivate to 60 beats/min frequency. Conditioned inhibitor. Conditioned inhibitor is a kind of differentiation inhibition. It occurs if a positive conditioned stimulus is reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus, but a combination of a conditioned stimulus and some additional neutral stimulus is not reinforced. For example, a conditioned stimulus, light, is reinforced by an unconditioned one, but a combination of light and sound, additional neutral stimulus, is not reinforced. At first, this combination evokes the same response as the light alone, but after some time it loses its signaling character, and in result the response to it disappears and remains only to conditioned stimulus, light. However, the sound acquires the inhibitory significance and in combination with other conditioned stimuli also inhibits the conditioned reflex. Conditioned inhibitor. Conditioned inhibitor is a kind of differentiation inhibition. It occurs if a positive conditioned stimulus is reinforced by an unconditioned stimulus, but a combination of a conditioned stimulus and some additional neutral stimulus is not reinforced. For example, a conditioned stimulus, light, is reinforced by an unconditioned one, but a combination of light and sound, additional neutral stimulus, is not reinforced. At first, this combination evokes the same response as the light alone, but after some time it loses its signaling character, and in result the response to it disappears and remains only to conditioned stimulus, light. However, the sound acquires the inhibitory significance and in combination with other conditioned stimuli also inhibits the conditioned reflex. Delayed inhibition. Delayed inhibition is characterized by response to a conditioned stimulus occurring immediately before application of an unconditioned stimulus. With the increase in the time interval between application of a conditioned stimulus and its reinforcement to 2 to 3 minutes, the conditioned response occurs with a longer and longer delay and finally occurs immediately before the reinforcement. A delay in the conditioned response after application of a conditioned stimulus evidences formation of delayed inhibition, with the period of delay corresponding to the period of delay in reinforcement. Conditioned inhibition permits the body to rid itself of many unnecessary and biologically unreasonable responses. The internal inhibition, according to Physiological, is the result of a competition between two streams of excitations for the ways to effectors. For example, in extinctive inhibition of the salivary food reflex, the competition is between a stream of excitations associated with the respective food reaction and excitations associated with a biologically negative reaction in the absence of reinforcement. A stronger, dominating excitation caused by dissatisfaction inhibits a weaker food-related excitation. Delayed inhibition. Delayed inhibition is characterized by response to a conditioned stimulus occurring immediately before application of an unconditioned stimulus. With the increase in the time interval between application of a conditioned stimulus and its reinforcement to 2 to 3 minutes, the conditioned response occurs with a longer and longer delay and finally occurs immediately before the reinforcement. A delay in the conditioned response after application of a conditioned stimulus evidences formation of delayed inhibition, with the period of delay corresponding to the period of delay in reinforcement. Conditioned inhibition permits the body to rid itself of many unnecessary and biologically unreasonable responses. The internal inhibition, according to Physiological, is the result of a competition between two streams of excitations for the ways to effectors. For example, in extinctive inhibition of the salivary food reflex, the competition is between a stream of excitations associated with the respective food reaction and excitations associated with a biologically negative reaction in the absence of reinforcement. A stronger, dominating excitation caused by dissatisfaction inhibits a weaker food-related excitation. What is it? Conditioned inhibitor. Delayed inhibition. Differentiating inhibition. Unconditioned inhibition. What is it? It is differentiating inhibition. What is it? Conditioned inhibitor. Delayed inhibition. Differentiating inhibition. Unconditioned inhibition. What is it? Pavlov's typology. Pavlov's typology. Pavlov's typology of higher nervous activity was the first systematic approach to the psychophysiology of individual differences. Ivan Pavlov's ideas of nervous system typology came from work with his dogs and his realization of individual differences. His observations of the dogs led to the idea of excitation and inhibition in the nervous system, and Pavlov theorized that the strength of these processes in the nervous system will determine whether the subject will have a strong or weak nervous system. This theory has influenced research in the field of social psychology and personality. Origins. Pavlov was a physiologist, and his ideas on typology stemmed from his research on dogs and his research on the brain. Pavlov's ideas of types were adopted from Hippocrates, as it was he who came up with the idea of individual differences. Hippocrates also proposed the 4 temperaments in man, and Pavlov, wanting to honor Hippocrates by use of Hippocrates terms for his own work. Pavlov started using observations and then used many experiments to show that there were many different distinguishing ways the nervous systems of dogs worked. Pavlov noticed the individual differences in the dogs through his research on salivary responses. He noticed there were weak and strong dogs. These groups were later divided into equilibrated and non-equilibrated, and then subdivided again into mobile and inert. Pavlov was a physiologist, and his ideas on typology stemmed from his research on dogs and his research on the brain. Pavlov's ideas of types were adopted from Hippocrates, as it was he who came up with the idea of individual differences. Hippocrates also proposed the 4 temperaments in man, and Pavlov, wanting to honor Hippocrates by use of Hippocrates terms for his own work. Pavlov started using observations and then used many experiments to show that there were many different distinguishing ways the nervous systems of dogs worked. Pavlov noticed the individual differences in the dogs through his research on salivary responses. He noticed there were weak and strong dogs. These groups were later divided into equilibrated and non-equilibrated, and then subdivided again into mobile and inert. Pavlov defined types of animal nervous system in one of 2 ways, either in terms of specific complexes of the properties of the nervous processes, characteristic for the given animal, or in terms of patterns of animal or human behavior. Pavlov proposed his classification of types on the differences in the properties of the nervous processes. The word type is used in 2 ways in the literature about higher nervous activity, either as a characteristic pattern of animal behavior or as a complex of the basic properties of the nervous processes. Definition. Pavlov's background as a physiologist greatly influenced his psychological research. His ideas for how the nervous system works came from his research on the brain, specifically the cortex, and conditioned and unconditioned reflexes, and spurred additional research into the nervous activity that underlies such reflexes. Pavlov introduced the ideas of strength of excitation and inhibition, as well as mobility, irradiation, and generalization in the central nervous system. Strength of excitation was considered to be the most important of the nervous system properties by Pavlov because we are often confronted by stimuli in the environment that grab our attention immediately. Excitation of the cells is simply their ability to do work, and this can either be very short-lived or extended and have varying intensities. This excitation can lead to the gain of conditioned responses, or the generalization of a conditioned response. Inhibition, on the other hand, is when a response that is already encoded is overcome or contained. Mobility is the ability of the nervous system to give one impulse priority over another. This can be done by having excitation before inhibition, or vice versa. Pavlov looked at the balance between excitation and inhibition and determined that there were different types of nervous systems. These observations were made about dogs, but Pavlov believed that they could be generalized to humans as well. The different types of nervous systems were categorized by Pavlov into strong and weak nervous systems with different subtypes under the strong type. These different types of systems were categorized based on the strength of excitation or inhibition in the system of the observed individual. Those individuals with weak nervous systems were thought by Pavlov to have limited adaptive abilities, while strong nervous systems were more adaptable. Although Pavlov's typology originated as a purely conceptual idea, Modern technology has helped research in the area to provide evidence for the processes of higher nervous activity that Pavlov hypothesized. Influence. Despite having been a conceptual nervous system based primarily on inferences, modern research has shown Pavlov's neuroconditioning system to be largely correct. In recent years, it has become the most functional means of correlating direct neural action and conditioned action. This has facilitated research to uncover the proper physical basis of learning. Influence. To prevent his system from being seen as mechanistic or reductionist while also trying to draw a basic distinction between animal and human learning, Pavlov wrote in 1927, "Of course a word is for man as much a real conditioned stimulus as are other stimuli common to men and animals, yet at the same time it is so all-comprehending that it allows no quantitative or qualitative comparisons with conditioned stimuli in animals." In 1932, Pavlov made the claim that speech is signals of signals or second signals. These second signals are, at their core, abstractions of reality in a method of generalization that is distinctive of human higher thought. He stated, again in 1932, "In man there comes to be another system of signalization, a signalization of the first system. A new principle of neural action is thus introduced. This is the Pavlov second signal system, principle that distinguishes verbal conditioning, or language acquisition, in man from first signal conditioning in men and animals." This view is different from most American behaviorists, who claim language is either a mediator, operating principally according to the laws of the reactions that it mediates, or is simply a conditioned vocal reaction. Pavlov's typology has been compared to psychologist Hans Eysenck's theory of the physiological bases of extroversion and introversion. This is principally due to Eysenck's use of the Pavlovian concepts of excitation, inhibition, and equilibrium of cortical nervous processes. Hippocrates' temperaments. Hippocrates' temperaments. The four-temperament theory is a proto-psychological theory which suggests that there are four fundamental personality types: sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Most formulations include the possibility of mixtures among the types where an individual's personality types overlap and they share two or more temperaments. Greek physician Hippocrates, c. 460, c. 370 BC, described the four temperaments as part of the ancient medical concept of humorism, that four bodily fluids affect human personality traits and behaviors. Modern medical science does not define a fixed relationship between internal secretions and personality, although some psychological personality type systems use categories similar to the Greek temperaments. Temperament theory has its roots in the ancient theory of humorism. It may have originated in Mesopotamia, but it was Greek physician Hippocrates, 460 to 370 BC, and later Galen, who developed it into a medical theory. He believed that certain human moods, emotions, and behaviors were caused by an excess or lack of body fluids, called humors, which he classified as blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, each of which was responsible for different patterns in personalities, as well as how susceptible you were to getting a disease. Galen, AD 129, c. 200, developed the first typology of temperament in his dissertation De Temperamentis, and searched for physiological reasons for different behaviors in humans. He classified them as hot/cold and dry/wet taken from the four elements. There could also be balance between the qualities, yielding a total of 9 temperaments. The word temperament itself comes from Latin temperare, to mix. In the ideal personality, the complementary characteristics were exquisitely balanced among warm, cool, and dry, moist. In four less ideal types, one of the four qualities was dominant over all the others. In the remaining four types, one pair of qualities dominated the complementary pair. For example, warm and moist dominated cool and dry. These last four were the temperamental categories which Galen named sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic after the bodily humors. Each was the result of an excess of one of the humors which produced the imbalance in paired qualities. For example, if one tended to be, or act, too happy, one can assume they have too much blood, since blood relates to sanguine, and can medically act accordingly. If one tended to be, or act, too calm or reserved, one can assume they have too much phlegm in the system, since phlegm relates to phlegmatic, and can medically act accordingly. If one tended to be, or act, Too sad, one can assume they have too much black bile in the system, since black bile relates to melancholic, and can medically act accordingly. If one tended to be, or act, too angry, one can assume they have too much yellow bile in the system, since yellow biles relates to choleric, and can medically act accordingly. Choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and phlegmatic temperaments, 17c, part of the Grande Command, 18th century depiction of the four temperaments, phlegmatic and choleric above, sanguine and melancholic below. Define. Hippocrates. Temperaments. People with what temperaments met? The properties of these humors also corresponded to the four seasons. Thus blood, which was considered hot and wet, corresponded to spring. Yellow bile, considered hot and dry, corresponded to summer. Black bile, cold and dry, corresponded to autumn. And finally, phlegm, cold and wet, corresponded to winter. Define. Hippocrates. Temperaments. It was not until the 1930s that Skinner suggested that covered behavior including cognition and emotions is subject to the same controlling variables as observable behavior, which became the basis for his philosophy called radical behaviorism. While Watson and Ivan Pavlov investigated how conditioned, neutral stimuli elicit reflexes in respondent conditioning, Skinner assessed the reinforcement histories of the discriminative, antecedent, stimuli that emits behavior. The technique became known as operant conditioning. Physiological basis of purposive behavior of humans and animals from the point of view of P.K. Anokin's theory of functional systems. Historical preconditions of theory of functional systems of Anokin. Pavlov's scientific school considers mechanisms of purposive behavior in higher animals and humans in terms of reflex theory. This means that this scientific school attempted to explain all diversity of the purposive behavior of animals and humans from the point of view of reflexes. A reflex is a mechanism of reflective activity of a human, and it terminates with a change in the state of an effector organ. Here, the extent of adaptive significance of this change does not depend on a reflex scheme. Besides, according to reflex theory, all forms of purposive behavior must be stimulus-dependent, that is, behavior must be determined by external and internal stimuli. But reasons determining purposive behavior in real life are more complicated, and behavior sometimes cannot be explained by reflex mechanisms alone. In this context, there arose a need in some theory which, without denying reflex principles of behavior, could explain the logical organization of behavior on a higher level of generalization. In our opinion, such a theory was proposed by a Russian physiologist Anokin and is called a theory of functional systems. Anokin's theory of functional systems. Scheme of the functional system of purposive behavioral act. Role of individual functional blocks in implementation of behavioral act. A functional system is a dynamic arrangement of central and peripheral structures and mechanisms that are coordinated to achieve useful adaptive results. In this situation, a useful adaptive result acts as a system-forming factor, for the sake of which the system is constructed. According to P. Anokin, a functional system of a purposive behavioral act has the following structure. A block diagram of the functional system of a purposive behavioral act, according to P. Anokin. E.A. Environmental afferentation, TA, trigger afferentation. Afferent synthesis is the first stage of formation of a purposive behavioral act. This stage provides answers to four questions. What is needed by an organism? How can it be achieved? How can it be done in the given situation? When can it be done? The first question arises in connection with a biological demand for something which evokes motivation. A biological demand is a non-compensated change in some homeostatic parameters, for example, in levels of glucose, lipids, amino acids. The term motivation is taken from psychology, where it means attraction to something. In a more specific sense, motivation is a well-realized need, demand. In physiology, motivation is understood as an emotionally colored condition of an organism based on a certain demand and manifested by selective excitation of certain structures of the central nervous system and by purposive behavior aimed at elimination of the initial demand. As soon as the motivational excitation is formed and becomes dominant, memory mechanisms are activated which retrieve from certain brain structures the information about earlier behavior of an organism in a similar situation. Thus, the answer to the second question is associated with activation of memory mechanism. A block diagram of the functional system of a purposive behavioral act, according to Pinokin. EA. Environmental afferentation, TA, trigger afferentation. Afferent synthesis is the first stage of formation of a purposive behavioral act. This stage provides answers to 4 questions. What is needed by an organism? How can it be achieved? How can it be done in the given situation? When can it be done? The first question arises in connection with a biological demand for something which evokes motivation. A biological demand is a non-compensated change in some homeostatic parameters, for example, in levels of glucose, lipids, amino acids. The term motivation is taken from psychology where it means attraction to something. In a more specific sense, motivation is a well-realized need, demand. In physiology, motivation is understood as an emotionally colored condition of an organism based on a certain demand and manifested by selective excitation of certain structures of the central nervous system and by purposive behavior aimed at elimination of the initial demand. As soon as the motivational excitation is formed and becomes dominant, memory mechanisms are activated which retrieve from certain brain structures the information about earlier behavior of an organism in a similar situation. Thus, the answer to the second question is associated with activation of memory mechanism. The third question is answered by evaluation of information entering an organism and result of activation of different sensory systems by stimuli coming from external environment. This information is called a situational afferentation. At last, realization of a purposive behavioral act is associated with a specific starting, triggering, stimulus, in the scheme, starting, triggering, afferentation. Decision-making is the stage of formation of the behavioral act associated with restrictions of the liberty of an organism. After the stage of afferent synthesis is completed, it becomes clear what is required for an organism, how it can be achieved, how it can be done in the given situation and when it can be done. However, every specific situation suggests several options of behavior, and at this stage of decision-making the most suitable one is selected. Efferent synthesis, program of behavior, is the stage of generation of a specific pattern of behavior which must lead to achievement of the useful adaptive result for an organism. Simultaneously, an acceptor of the result of behavior is formed. The third question is answered by evaluation of information entering an organism and result of activation of different sensory systems by stimuli coming from external environment. This information is called a situational afferentation. At last, realization of a purposive behavioral act is associated with a specific starting, triggering, stimulus, in the scheme, starting, triggering, afferentation. Decision-making is the stage of formation of the behavioral act associated with restrictions of the liberty of an organism. After the stage of afferent synthesis is completed, it becomes clear what is required for an organism, how it can be achieved, how it can be done in the given situation and when it can be done. However, every specific situation suggests several options of behavior, and at this stage of decision-making the most suitable one is selected. Efferent synthesis, program of behavior, is the stage of generation of a specific pattern of behavior which must lead to achievement of the useful adaptive result for an organism. Simultaneously, an acceptor of the result of behavior is formed. Acceptor of the result of behavior, action, is a functional block that stores information about parameters of the ideal model of the desired result. Besides, the acceptor of behavioral result compares parameters of the actual result with the parameters of the ideal model of the result. There may be 2 variants of comparison of parameters of the actual result with the ideal model. The first variant, parameters of the actual result fully coincide with those of the ideal model. Pinokin called this situation match. This situation produces positive emotions which confirm that the behavior that has led to this result was correct. Positive emotions indicate achievement of the useful adaptive result, and the functional system completes its function. The second variant, parameters of the actual result do not meet the parameters of the ideal model. Pinokin called this situation mismatch. Mismatch generates negative emotions which indicate a failure in achievement of the result. In this context, there may occur either an enhancement of behavior aimed at achievement of the required result, or cessation of the behavior due to inability to achieve the required result. Pinokin linked the above processes occurring in acceptor of the behavioral result with physiological mechanisms of emotions, and called the theory explaining the origin of emotions in terms of processes occurring in an acceptor of behavioral result, a biological theory of emotions. Acceptor of the result of behavior, action, is a functional block that stores information about parameters of the ideal model of the desired result. Besides, the acceptor of behavioral result compares parameters of the actual result with the parameters of the ideal model of the result. There may be two variants of comparison of parameters of the actual result with the ideal model. The first variant, parameters of the actual result fully coincide with those of the ideal model. Pianokin called this situation match. This situation produces positive emotions which confirm that the behavior that has led to this result was correct. Positive emotions indicate achievement of the useful adaptive result, and the functional system completes its function. The second variant, parameters of the actual result do not meet the parameters of the ideal model. Pianokin called this situation mismatch. Mismatch generates negative emotions which indicate a failure in achievement of the result. In this context, there may occur either an enhancement of behavior aimed at achievement of the required result, or cessation of the behavior due to inability to achieve the required result. Anokin linked the above processes occurring in acceptor of the behavioral result with physiological mechanisms of emotions, and called the theory explaining the origin of emotions in terms of processes occurring in an acceptor of behavioral result, a biological theory of emotions. Ethology. Ethology is a branch of zoology that studies animal behavior, usually with a scientific focus on behavior under natural conditions, and viewing behavior as an evolutionarily adaptive trait. Behaviorism as a term also describes the scientific and objective study of animal behavior, usually referring to measured responses to stimuli or to trained behavioral responses in a laboratory context, without a particular emphasis on evolutionary adaptivity. Throughout history, different naturalists have studied aspects of animal behavior. Ethology has its scientific roots in the work of Charles Darwin and of American and German ornithologists of the late 19th and early 20th century, including Charles O. Whitman, Oscar Heinroth, and Wallace Craig. The modern discipline of ethology is generally considered to have begun during the 1930s with the work of Dutch biologist Nicolaas Tinbergen and Austrian biologists Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch, the three recipients of the 1973 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Ethology combines laboratory and field science, with a strong relation to some other disciplines such as neuroanatomy, ecology, and evolutionary biology. Ethologists typically show interest in a behavioral process rather than in a particular animal group, and often study one type of behavior, such as aggression, in a number of unrelated species. Ethology is a rapidly growing field. Since the dawn of the 21st century, researchers have re-examined and reached new conclusions in many aspects of animal communication, emotions, culture, learning and sexuality that the scientific community long thought it understood. New fields, such as neuroethology, have developed. Understanding ethology or animal behavior can be important in animal training. Considering the natural behaviors of different species or breeds enables trainers to select the individuals best suited to perform the required task. It also enables trainers to encourage the performance of naturally occurring behaviors and the discontinuance of undesirable behaviors. Charles Henry Turner was an American zoologist, educator, and comparative psychologist, known for his studies on the behavior of insects, particularly bees, and ants. Turner was the first African American to receive a graduate degree at the University of Cincinnati and most likely the first African American to earn a PhD from the University of Chicago. Being a black man in the 19th century, he was a victim of racism. He spent most of his career as a high school teacher in Sumner High School in St. Louis. Turner published 49 papers on invertebrates, including Habits of Mound-Building Ants, Experiments on the Color Vision of the Honeybee, Hunting Habits of an American Sand Wasp, and Psychological Notes on the Gallery Spider. He concluded from the variations seen in spider web construction that the details in the construction involved intelligence rather than mere instinct as then attributed. Turner became the first person to prove that insects can hear and can distinguish pitch. In addition, he first discovered that cockroaches can learn by trial and error and that honeybees can see visual patterns. Although he attempted to demonstrate that bees were endowed with color vision capabilities, his experiments could not prove this as he used red cardboards to this end, which bees do not see as a color. Yet, in doing these experiments, he advanced important principles of associative learning such as stimulus substitution, the fact that a conditioning stimulus becomes a reliable predictor of an unconditioned stimulus. Turner's work was different from the majority of scientists of his time as he clearly adopted a cognitive perspective to analyze animal behavior. He used concepts such as learning, memory, and expectation, in a time when most scientists believed that animals such as insects were exclusively driven by reflexive taxis, innate reactions to external stimuli. This cognitive view would only re-emerge much later in studies of animal behavior. Karl Ritter von Frisch was a German-Austrian ethologist. His work centered on investigations of the sensory perceptions of the honeybee, and he was one of the first to translate the meaning of the waggle dance. His theory, described in his 1927 book Aus dem Lebenderbienen, translated into English as The Dancing Bees, was disputed by other scientists and greeted with skepticism at the time. Only much later was it shown to be an accurate theoretical analysis. Frisch studied aspects of animal behavior, including animal navigation, in the Carniolan honeybee citation needed, Apis mellifera carnica, a subspecies of the European honeybee. Frisch discovered that bees can distinguish various blossoming plants by their scent, and that each bee is flower constant. Surprisingly, their sensitivity to a sweet taste is only slightly stronger than in humans. He thought it possible that a bee's spatial sense of smell arises from the firm coupling of its olfactory sense with its tactile sense. Frisch was the second to demonstrate that honeybees had color vision, the first being Charles Henry Turner, which he accomplished by using classical conditioning. He trained bees to feed on a dish of sugar water set on a colored card. He then set the colored card in the middle of a set of gray-toned cards. If the bees see the colored card as a shade of gray, then they will confuse the blue card with at least one of the gray-toned cards. Bees arriving to feed will visit more than one card in the array. On the other hand, if they have color vision, then the bees visit only the blue card, as it is visually distinct from the other cards. A bee's color perception is comparable to that of humans, but with a shift away from the red toward the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. For that reason, bees cannot distinguish red from black, colorless, but they can distinguish the colors white, yellow, blue and violet. Color pigments which reflect UV radiation expand the spectrum of colors which can be differentiated. For example, several blossoms which may appear to humans to be of the same yellow color will appear to bees as having different colors, multicolored patterns, because of their different proportions of ultraviolet. Knowledge of foraging areas can be passed on from bee to bee. The means of communication is a special dance, which can be of two types: round dance and waggle dance. Round dance. The round dance provides the information that there is a feeding place in the vicinity of the beehive at a distance between 50 and 100 meters, without the particular direction being given. By means of close contact among the bees, it also supplies information about the type of food, blossom scent. The foraging bee begins to perform a kind of round dance. On the part of the comb where she is sitting, she starts whirling around in a narrow circle, constantly changing her direction, turning now right, now left, dancing clockwise and anti-clockwise, in quick succession, describing between 1 and 2 circles in each direction. This dance is performed among the thickest bustle of the hive. What makes it so particularly striking and attractive is the way it infects the surrounding bees. Those sitting next to the dancer start tripping after her, always trying to keep their outstretched feelers on close contact with the tip of her abdomen. They take part in each of her maneuverings so that the dancer herself, in her mid-wheeling movements, appears to carry behind her a perpetual comet's tail of bees. Waggle dance. The waggle dance is used to relay information about more distant food sources. In order to do this, the dancing bee moves forward a certain distance on the vertically hanging honeycomb in the hive, then traces a half circle to return to her starting point, whereupon the dance begins again. On the straight stretch, the bee waggles with her posterior. The direction of the straight stretch contains the information about the direction of the food source, the angle between the straight stretch and the vertical being precisely the angle which the direction of flight has to the position of the sun. The distance to the food source is relayed by the time taken to traverse the straight stretch, 1 second indicating a distance of approximately 1 kilometer, so the speed of the dance is inversely related to the actual distance. The other bees take in the information by keeping in close contact with the dancing bee and reconstructing its movements. They also receive information via their sense of smell about what is to be found at the food source, type of food, pollen, propolis, water, as well as its specific characteristics. The orientation functions so well that the bees can find a food source with the help of the waggle dance, even if there are hindrances they must detour around like an intervening mountain. Konrad Zacharias Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was an Austrian zoologist, ethologist, and ornithologist. He is often regarded as one of the founders of modern ethology, the study of animal behavior. He developed an approach that began with an earlier generation, including his teacher Oskar Heinroth. Lorenz studied instinctive behavior in animals, especially in greylag geese and jackdaws. Working with geese, he investigated the principle of imprinting, the process by which some nidifugous birds, i.e. birds that leave their nest early, bond instinctively with the first moving object that they see within the first hours of hatching. Although Lorenz did not discover the topic, he became widely known for his descriptions of imprinting as an instinctive bond. In 1936 he met Tinbergen, and the two collaborated in developing ethology as a separate subdiscipline of biology. Lorenz has been called the father of ethology by Tinbergen. Perhaps Lorenz's most important contribution to ethology was his idea that behavior patterns can be studied as anatomical organs. Another of his contributions to ethology is his work on imprinting. In psychology and ethology, imprinting is any kind of phase-sensitive learning occurring at a particular age or a particular life stage, that is rapid and apparently independent of the consequences of behavior. It was first used to describe situations in which an animal or person learns the characteristics of some stimulus, which is therefore said to be imprinted onto the subject. Imprinting is hypothesized to have a critical period. Filial imprinting. The best known form of imprinting is filial imprinting, in which a young animal narrows its social preferences to an object, typically a parent, as a result of exposure to that object. It is most obvious in nidifugous birds, which imprint on their parents and then follow them around. It was first reported in domestic chickens, by Sir Thomas More in 1516 as described in his treatise Utopia, 350 years earlier than by the 19th century amateur biologist Douglas Spalding. It was rediscovered by the early ethologist Oskar Heinroth, and studied extensively and popularized by his disciple Konrad Lorenz working with greylag geese. Lorenz demonstrated how incubator-hatched geese would imprint on the first suitable moving stimulus they saw within what he called a critical period, between 13 and 16 hours shortly after hatching. For example, the goslings would imprint on Lorenz himself, to be more specific, on his wading boots, and he is often depicted being followed by a gaggle of geese who had imprinted on him. Lorenz also found that the geese could imprint on inanimate objects. In one notable experiment, they followed a box placed on a model train in circles around the track. Filial imprinting is not restricted to non-human animals that are able to follow their parents, however. Konrad Lorenz being followed by his imprinted geese. The filial imprinting of birds was a primary technique used to create the movie Winged Migration, Le Peuple Migrateur, which contains a great deal of footage of migratory birds in flight. The birds imprinted on handlers, who wore yellow jackets and honked horns constantly. The birds were then trained to fly along with a variety of aircraft, primarily ultralights. In a similar project, orphaned Canada geese were trained to their normal migration route by the Canadian ultralight enthusiast Bill Lishman, as shown in the fact-based movie drama Fly Away Home. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, took to the skies in a motorized glider in a bid to guide young Siberian white cranes on their migration route on the Yamal Peninsula, September 6, 2012. Sexual imprinting. Sexual imprinting is the process by which a young animal learns the characteristics of a desirable mate. For example, male zebra finches appear to prefer mates with the appearance of the female bird that rears them. Sexual attraction to humans can develop in non-human mammals or birds as a result of sexual imprinting when reared from young by humans. One example is London Zoo female giant panda Chi-Chi when taken to Moscow Zoo for mating with the male giant panda Anan. She refused his attempts to mate with her, but made a full sexual self-presentation to a zookeeper. It commonly occurs in falconry birds reared from hatching by humans. Such birds are called imprints in falconry. When an imprint must be bred from, the breeder lets the male bird copulate with their head while they are wearing a special hat with pockets on to catch the male bird's semen. The breeder then courts a suitable imprint female bird, including offering food, if it is part of that species as normal courtship. At copulation, The breeder puts the flat of one hand on the female bird's back to represent the weight of a male bird, and with the other hand uses a pipette, or a hypodermic syringe without a needle, to squirt the semen into the female's cloaca. Sexual imprinting on inanimate objects is a popular theory concerning the development of sexual fetishism. For example, according to this theory, imprinting on shoes or boots, as with Konrad Lorenz's geese, would be the cause of shoe fetishism. Limbic imprinting. Some suggest that prenatal, perinatal and postnatal experiences leave imprints upon the limbic system, causing lifelong effects, and this process is identified as limbic imprinting. The term is also described as the human emotional map, deep-seated beliefs and values that are stored in the brain's limbic system and govern people's lives at the subconscious level. It is one of the suggested explanations for the claim that the experiences of an infant, particularly during the first 2 years of his life, contribute to his lifelong psychological development. Imprinted genes can have astounding effects on body size, brain size, and the process in which the brain organizes its processes. Evolutionary trends within the animal kingdom have been shown to show substantive increase in the forebrain, particularly towards the limbic system. This evolution has even been thought of to have a mutative effect on the brain size trickling down the human ancestry. Westermarck effect. Reverse sexual imprinting is also seen in instances where two people who live in domestic proximity during the first few years in the life of either one become desensitized to later close sexual attraction to each other. This phenomenon, known as the Westermarck effect, was first formally described by Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermarck in his book The History of Human Marriage, 1891. The Westermarck effect has since been observed in many places and cultures, including in the Israeli kibbutz system, and the Chinese Shimpua marriage customs, as well as in biological-related families. In the case of the Israeli kibbutzim, collective farms, children were reared somewhat communally in peer groups, based on age, not biological relation. A study of the marriage patterns of these children later in life revealed that out of the nearly 3,000 marriages that occurred across the kibbutz system, only 14 were between children from the same peer group. Of those 14, none had been reared together during the first 6 years of life. This result provides evidence not only that the Westermarck effect is demonstrable but that it operates during the period from birth to the age of 6. However, Aron Shor and Dalit Sinchai claimed that the case of the kibbutzim actually provides little support for the Westermarck effect. When proximity during this critical period does not occur, for example, where a brother and sister are brought up separately, never meeting one another, they may find one another highly sexually attractive when they meet as adults. This phenomenon is known as genetic sexual attraction. This observation supports the hypothesis that the Westermarck effect evolved because it's suppressed in breeding. This attraction may also be seen with cousin couples. Sigmund Freud argued that as children, members of the same family naturally lust for one another, making it necessary for societies to create incest taboos, but Westermarck argued the reverse, that the taboos themselves arise naturally as products of innate attitudes. Steven Pinker has written that Freud's conception of an urge to incest may have derived from Freud's own erotic reaction to his mother as a boy, attested in Freud's own writings, and speculates that Freud's reaction may have been due to lack of intimacy with his mother in early childhood, as Freud was wet-nursed. Baby duck syndrome. In human, computer interaction, baby duck syndrome denotes the tendency for computer users to imprint on the first system they learn, then judge other systems by their similarity to that first system. The result is that users generally prefer systems similar to those they learned on and dislike unfamiliar systems. The issue may present itself relatively early in a computer user's experience, and it has been observed to impede education of students in new software systems or user interfaces. When imprinting studies go awry. Konrad Lorenz was sent to the Russian front in 1944, where he quickly became a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union from 1944 to 1948. In captivity in Soviet Armenia, he continued to work as a medic and became tolerably fluent in Russian and got quite friendly with some Russians, mostly doctors. When he was repatriated, he was allowed to keep the manuscript of a book he had been writing, and his pet starling. He arrived back in Altenburg, his family home, near Vienna, both with manuscript and bird intact. The manuscript became his 1973 book Behind the Mirror. King Solomon's Ring is a general audience zoological book, written by Austrian scientist Konrad Lorenz in 1949. The first English-language edition was published in 1952. The English title refers to the legendary Seal of Solomon, a ring that supposedly gave King Solomon the power to speak to animals. Lorenz claimed to have achieved this feat of communication with several species, by raising them in and around his home and observing their behavior. King Solomon's ring describes the methods of his investigation and his resulting conclusions about animal psychology. Nicolaas Tinbergen. Nico Tinbergen was a Dutch biologist and ornithologist. He is regarded as one of the founders of modern ethology, the study of animal behavior. In 1951, he published The Study of Instinct, an influential book on animal behavior. In the 1960s, he collaborated with filmmaker Hugh Falcoes on a series of wildlife films, including The Riddle of the Rook, 1972, and Signals for Survival, 1969, which won the Italia Prize in that year and the American Blue Ribbon in 1971. In 1951, Tinbergen's The Study of Instinct was published. Behavioral ecologists and evolutionary biologists still recognize the contribution this book offered the field of behavioral science studies. The Study of Instinct summarizes Tinbergen's ideas on innate behavioral reactions in animals and the adaptiveness and evolutionary aspects of these behaviors. By behavior, he means the total movements made by the intact animal. Innate behavior is that which is not changed by the learning process. The major question of the book is the role of internal and external stimuli in controlling the expression of behavior. In particular, he was interested in explaining spontaneous behaviors, those that occurred in their complete form the first time they were performed and that seemed resistant to the effects of learning. He explains how behavior can be considered a combination of these spontaneous behavior patterns and as set series of reactions to particular stimuli. Behavior is a reaction in that to a certain extent it is reliant on external stimuli, however it is also spontaneous since it is also dependent upon internal causal factors. His model for how certain behavioral reactions are provoked was based on work by Konrad Lorenz. Who discovered and deciphered the meaning of bee dances? Frisch, Lorenz, Pavlov, Tinbergen, Turner. Who discovered and deciphered the meaning of bee dances? Intelligence. Human intelligence. Human intelligence is the intellectual capability of humans, which is marked by complex cognitive feats and high levels of motivation and self-awareness. Through intelligence, humans possess the cognitive abilities to learn, form concepts, understand, apply logic and reason, including the capacities to recognize patterns, plan, innovate, solve problems, make decisions, retain information, and use language to communicate. There are conflicting ideas about how intelligence is measured, ranging from the idea that intelligence is fixed upon birth to the idea that it is malleable and can change depending on an individual's mindset and efforts. In psychometrics, human intelligence is commonly assessed by intelligence quotient, IQ, tests, although the validity of these tests is disputed. Several subcategories of intelligence, such as emotional intelligence and social intelligence, have been proposed, and there remains significant debate as to whether these represent distinct forms of intelligence. In general, it is thought that higher intelligence is associated with better outcomes in life. An intelligence quotient, IQ, is a total score derived from a set of standardized tests or subtests designed to assess human intelligence. The abbreviation IQ was coined by the psychologist William Stern for the German term Intelligenz quotient, his term for a scoring method for intelligence tests at University of Breslau he advocated in a 1912 book. Historically, IQ was a score obtained by dividing a person's mental age score, obtained by administering an intelligence test, by the person's chronological age, both expressed in terms of years and months. The resulting fraction, quotient, was multiplied by 100 to obtain the IQ score. For modern IQ tests, the raw score is transformed to a normal distribution with mean 100 and standard deviation 15. This results in approximately 2/3 of the population scoring between IQ 85 and IQ 115 and about 2.5% each above 130 and below 70.